Hello, everybody. So now that we've had some practice with the mannequin, we want to start building out the figure and adding some 3 dimension to it. Once again, it's not necessary to learn every muscle and tendon in the body, although it would be extremely helpful. What's more important is to reduce all the objects to their basic, simple forms. Just like in perspective, when you start to break it down, the human body can be simplified easily into spheres for the head, cylinders for the arms, legs, and torso, and cubes for the hands and feet. So if you can draw those basic forms, you can draw the human body. So let's look back at our mannequin. You always want to start with the mannequin. This is our simplified skeleton. However, when you start to look at the body from the outside, when you look at the arms, legs, and torso, really they can all be reduced to cylinders. So even though I may have said we won't be dealing with perspective now, the human form still exists in perspective. Everything in the world exists in perspective. And knowing how these shapes rotate and move through 3-dimensional space will help you build a successful human form. Don't worry, we don't need any vanishing points or anything like that, but it's more of an understanding how cylinders move and rotate through 3-dimensional space. And to be a little bit more accurate, we're going to be dealing with modified cylinders, which is basically a tapered cylinder that has a little bit more shape to it. So our people don't end up looking like robots, they look like actual human forms. So if you look at the torso itself, you really want to think of it as 2 parts. And really, it looks just like drinking glasses. They're narrow at one end and then wider at the other end here. So you can see just like that. And as the spine bends, the glasses never change shape, just the space between them does. Just like I was talking about how your rib cage and your pelvis and your head, they never change shape. All the movement comes from the spine, the bending in the spine itself. And it's really important to make sure you draw the edges of the glasses to create the ellipses here. This is why we're thinking of these as glasses, as clear glasses that we can see through. This will help you visualize the 3-dimensional shapes. See, all these pieces are cylinders with ellipses on the ends of them. All of that is really, really important to understand how those arms and legs are bending and moving. You can easily visualize the upper and lower parts of the arm as modified cylinders, represented by 2 shapes of glasses once again. The shapes are longer and slimmer than those of the torso, but the principle is basically the same. You want to make sure you draw the cylinder's ellipses, the ellipses on here, which help determine the degree of foreshortening that's involved in the pose itself. And that is the reason why it's so important to draw all the way through the form and don't just draw the outline. The legs are the same thing, but they're even a little longer and heavier than the arms. The major difference is that the joints are hinged in opposite directions. The arms bend up, the legs bend down. Otherwise, it's the same approach. And notice for each one of these parts, the upper arm, the lower arm, the upper leg, the lower leg, that it is wider at the higher end and gets narrower as it goes towards your extremities. Same thing with your thigh here. It's wider up at the top, gets narrower towards the knee. Then the lower leg, the calf is wider at the top and gets narrower at the ankle. Each one of these parts. That's really important to make sure you get those shapes right. Even though we're not memorizing the muscles, you want to think about that calf muscle that sticks out here. You want to think of that thigh muscle that's thicker at the top. Up here we got our biceps that are bigger up here and it gets narrower down towards the elbow. All those things you want to make sure you think about. And one thing to notice is that these don't connect. You're not actually connecting at the joints here between the legs and the arms. You want to keep that gap because that's where we're going to have a circle that will be our joint. And that will change depending on, if your arm is straight or bent. But the main shape of these forms will not change. And that's why you don't want to actually draw the elbow and the knee connecting them. You're just going to leave a space, just like if they were two glasses that were attaching. So there are a few things I want you to remember as you're constructing the form. First of all, drawing through. You want to imagine each form as a clear glass and draw all the way through. Draw those ellipses. You want to see the structural lines of each ellipse, whether or not you can actually see it or not, if there's something in front of it. Three-dimensional. Remember, these are all three-dimensional forms. You're not drawing circles or ovals, you're drawing spheres and cylinders. So make sure everything appears to have depth. Construction versus outlining. Do not merely just draw the outline. You got to remember it's a three-dimensional form. So that's why you want to make sure the objects are well constructed and have depth and are drawn all the way through. Modified cylinders. Remember, we're not just drawing perfect cylinders, even though I'm saying cylinder. What we really want is a modified cylinder, which is more of a tapered cylinder that's been modified slightly to have a little bit more definition and more implication of the muscles. And then foreshortening, and this is the tricky one. When an object is tilted towards or away from you, it creates what is called foreshortening. It appears to diminish in size and change in shape as it goes backwards. So even though this cylinder is technically, let's say it's the same size for each one of them, as it rotates toward us, it appears to be smaller. So in the case of the cylinder, you'll notice that the sides actually become shorter itself. It's long here, gets a little bit shorter, gets a little bit shorter, and that the ellipses become more open. See, it's a much narrower ellipse. This one becomes more open, and this one becomes more open until if it was turned all the way towards us, it would be a circle. And that's the key to doing foreshortening, because foreshortening is definitely the trickiest part about drawing a figure. So, how do we do this? Let us build out our cylinders. So, we want to remember we're going to start with a mannequin every single time. You always start by drawing that inner structure. Once you have that narrowed down, then you're going to build your modified cylinders on top of that to create a three-dimensional form. So I'm going to start with the torso here. Now, there isn't a whole lot that's happening in the torso, but you kind of want to get something that's a little bit wider at the top, has the implication of where the shoulders are, and then make sure you get that ellipse at the bottom. And it's really important, these ellipses, because this tells me that that torso is tilted backwards, right? That he's tilting back and we're seeing underneath it. Just like in perspective, we're seeing underneath that there. So that's an important key to this. Our pelvis here. We're not doing a whole lot of it. You almost want to kind of think of it as like the shape of like a bikini or a diaper, really. So the important thing is getting that ellipse on top here. Thinking that we are looking down at this ellipse because it's tilted forward. Maybe it's not tilted quite that forward. I'm going to tilt it a little bit less. And that's what's going to make or break every single shape is, how tilted are they? And that's what will create that depth. And I'm going to connect it with my spine here. You also, some people like to connect it here, do the outside of the forms. But that, I think, is kind of a more later step. I just want to keep it to the basic cylinders for now. And we could put the head in here. It's already in, but we'll just draw it in. Add a neck. You want to think of that neck. We're looking up at it since we're looking up at the head. We're seeing it connected underneath, inside the neck there. Okay, our arm. Here is our arm socket. We want to think of that cylinder actually coming out and around on top of the arm there. Think of our muscles. It's wider at the top, gets narrower towards the elbow here. And before you get to the elbow, you're going to draw that cylinder. And remember, the narrower that ellipse is, the straighter on it is to us. If I drew it a really wide ellipse, like this, that means that arm is bending towards us. but in this case, I'm having it more go towards the side, so it's a pretty narrow ellipse. And then I'm going to draw the upper arm, the forearm rather, narrower towards the hand, a little bit wider over here, leaving a little bit of space in between for where that joint is. Okay, this one here, this is actually, we can't really see this one, but I'm still gonna try to lightly draw in where my arm is connected behind here. And this one, we've got some foreshortening because it's going away from us. Tilted backwards there. And then let's draw our wrist. This one's actually tilted away from us here. And at this angle, they will overlap a bit, which is fine. We want to have that overlapping. Our legs, they're going to fit on kind of like that like diaper or bathing suit here, go around the side. And where your thighs are thicker up at the top, narrower as you get towards the leg. This one's pretty straight on, so I'm going to do a pretty narrow ellipse. And it's in front of our lower part of the ankle here. This is actually going behind it. This side, think about that, how it attaches. Here, probably won't see that much of it. And think attaches, get wider for our thigh, have some overlap. This one's pretty straight on here. And we got that bend. Remember thinking of the glasses. If you had two glasses next to each other, what would the opening of those glasses look like? Wider for our calf, narrower to the ankle. And there we go. And that is our person in modifying cylinders. If you want to add a little bit more shape to the feet, you can turn these into more cube-like forms. I like to think of the upper part of the foot and the bottom part of the foot as two essential pieces. It's not totally cube-like, but if you want to think of it in more boxy forms as those two basic pieces, kind of like the foot and then the toes itself, that will create that 3-dimension. And then the hands can even be more like two boxes as well. Instead of quite mittens. It's not a whole lot of a change, but thinking them more of like actual flattened cubes. And then we have our mannequin now built out as a 3-dimensional form. We have added flesh to him. We've constructed the basic pieces of his body. Without getting too complicated, you can do something like this with very simple forms, really just cylinders stacked on top of each other.